Ok, siamo in streaming.
Hello, thank you all for joining us today to discuss about a very important contribution to our field of study, which is Ancient Women Writers of Greece and Rome by Bartolo, Natoli, Angela Pitts, and Judith Hallett. We have here today the three authors, and we have three discussants. The authors are Bartolo Natoli, Associate Professor of Classics and Women, Gender and Sexuality Program Affiliate at Randolph-Macon College. I will be very brief in the presentation because we want to hear the authors, just to say it in advance. Among his many publications, I just want to mention Silenced Voices, The Poetics of Speech in Ovid, and an edited volume entitled Teaching Classics with Technology. Angela Pitts is Professor of Classics at the University of Mary Washington and has published in, has many interests, but her main topics range from soundscape in Homer's Iliad to Sappho's reception in antiquity. Judith Hallett is doesn't need any presentation, but we will do it anyways. Is Professor of Classics and Distinguished Scholar Teacher, Professor Emerita at the University of Maryland. She has published widely, as you all know, in the areas of Latin language and literature, women, the family, sexuality, and Greek and Roman antiquity. And among the many, many honors which she has received, I would like to mention that she has just received the 2023 Randall Howarth Award for Excellence in Mentoring, which is particularly telling. I think it's a very important award. And for our discussants, who are all in Siena, Simone Beta, also, well, no one needs presentation, but let's do it anyways. Simone studies classical theater, especially Greek and Latin comedy, rhetoric, with a focus on puzzles, riddles, enigmas, dreams, epigrammic poetry, and many others. Cristiana Franco is a professor of classics at the University for Foreigners of Siena, and her research focuses on the representation of animals and on human-animal relationships in the ancient world. But also, most importantly for our seminar, she also works on the ideological strategies of the covert cultural construction of gender in ancient societies. Finally, last but not least, Luca Graverini is full professor of classics at the University of Siena. He's a specialist of Apuleius, of Roman and Greek novel, of the study of emotions in antiquity, and among his many interests and publications, I would like to mention his work on Aetia by the poet Callimachus. So, to give the floor immediately to our authors, I would just like to repeat that this is really an impressive contribution to our studies, because it is a volume that makes accessible the ancient texts to a broader audience. So each Greek and Roman text is translated, has a very in-depth commentary, philological commentary, and a summary which speaks about the context, and also a relevant bibliography and a translation in English. I think I will leave immediately the floor, because of course, Simone and Cristiana will focus on Greece, and Luca and myself will focus on Rome. And of course, you're all invited to ask questions to the authors. I would like to immediately ask the authors of the challenges of this translation, of the selection of the text, how they selected them. And I would like to forward a very important question raised by Luca Graverini, that immediately said that there is a leitmotif, a red thread of poetry that goes throughout the book, as if these women voices coming from so far away always express themselves in verse. So I would like to start with Angela, then Bartolo, and then Judith. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, Aglaia, thank you so very much for welcoming us today to
to speak with your colleagues and your students. It's such a delight to see everyone, and I'm most appreciative. I'm really, I feel just incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity as well to work with my colleagues, Bart and Judith. For me, it was just an extraordinary adventure in which we had the opportunity to, spend every day and night as much time as our schedules would allow to delve deeply into the voices of women from antiquity, who whose voices I think just simply don't get enough opportunity to be read, particularly in the undergraduate curriculum, perhaps at least in the United States. And certainly not, it's been my experience here in the US, not as often, especially in Greek classes, a little bit more in Latin. Although I will say that I had the opportunity to study Sappho with Patricia Rosemeyer as a graduate student, and that was she set me on an incredibly enriching path. So our intention for writing this book was to try to make the voices of women more accessible, especially for undergraduates, but as well maybe for people who are interested in the voices of women, but maybe only have a little bit of Greek and Latin or no Greek and Latin whatsoever, at least for speakers of English. We were writing during most of the time we were writing this book was in the midst of COVID, and it was also a time in which I saw worldwide women's rights and sovereignty starting to experience something of a contraction. And so I think that was, for me at least, an opportunity to make a contribution. So we wanted to include Greek and Latin texts, key vocabulary. The vocabulary that we chose, at least on the Greek side, is vocabulary that is not included in the college Greek exam, which is promoted by the Classical Association of the Middle West and South and published every year. And that is a list of vocabulary that is generally expected intermediate students of Greek, at least in the United States, have some command over. So we also wanted to provide commentaries for students that were aimed at about the intermediate level, along with appendices on dialects and meter, some introductory essays that, as you mentioned, helped to provide contacts for each of the authors, some select bibliography, and then also translations, which can be helpful. And then finally, notes for those who are reading in translation, who may not be, say, familiar with who Priebus is or something like that. So again, the goal was to try to make to push out and make far more widely accessible women writers of Greece and Rome. Bart, did you want to add? Because Bart, initially, I want to draw Bart's voice in here because he actually approached me. I think we were at a conference, and we thought maybe this would be a really great idea. Is there anything that I'm missing, Bart, that you would want to add?
Yeah, I can add some further context to what Angela was mentioning. The genesis of the project came from students. For me in particular, most universities in America have some sort of undergraduate class on women in antiquity or something along those lines. And as I taught that class here at Randolph-Macon, I recognized that most of the content that we were using, although correct, put women in the position of the object and was only using texts written by men about women and weren't using texts that women themselves were writing and proliferating rather. So I went about trying to find these texts and put them all together, and it looked like to me we would need a book list of 10 to 15 books for our undergraduates to get to the texts, which is cost prohibitive for a lot of them. And so the genesis of it was, can we put together a volume that has all the original text and the translation and commentary geared towards students and not towards academics, so that we can use this in the classroom? And Angela is right. This is I guess a 3-year project, just to emphasize to those of you all out there who are thinking about publishing how long it takes. This started with an initial conversation at the 2019 CAMWIS annual meeting in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so from that moment, where it was Angela and I at some vegan restaurant, I think it was, in passing out, what should we put in this volume? It went from there to trying to find texts that would speak to undergrads, and to Professor Graverini's question regarding kind of the heightened sense of poetry in this. At least on the Latin side, what I found as a struggle was finding enough Latin for students to actually read. Because there's plenty on the Greek side that Angela was pulling, and I was always trying to find more that was substantial, not just a line or 2 or 5, but something that had a narrative flow to it that our undergraduates could work through and gravitate towards. So that the poetry lended itself to it. A lot of those prose texts that we were considering were a little bit later. And so we made at least I made a conscious decision to kind of draw the line at the Christian era and not bring in things like Perpetua and Proba and Agaria and some of the later stuff, which is valuable and needs to be said. But it did kind of skew the selection a bit, but it was for getting longer passages in particular. I'll pass it to Judith for.
Wonderful. You were very, very effective and brief. Let me just add that we have with us Leo Pepe, who is our scholar, very distinguished scholar of Roman law, who wrote Civis Romana, which is a very important book. And here is Judith. Are you opening some? No, someone opened some dashboard. Who has to close? Martina ha aperto qualcosa che deve chiudere. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Sorry, here. And lots of other friends coming in, I will mention. Judith, here. Would you like to speak now?
Judith?
Yeah, I'm having trouble with the sound. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, I came in at the very end. Bartolo and Angela came up to me at a meeting of the centennial meeting of the American Classical League in June 2019 and asked if I would do the introduction. And it was my pleasure and honor to do so. To get back to some points that Angela and Bartolo have made already, the way I've structured the introduction is I call it male and female lenses on these texts. And the introduction initially surveys men's contributions over the millennia to the survival, the rediscovery, and the assessment of women's poetic texts from classical antiquity. I chose to focus on the work of the archaic Greek lyric poet Sappho, Augustan Roman elegist Sulpicia. And then after talking about what we owe to men, I looked at women's contributions, and which are more recent, they're less extensive, but they're strikingly distinctive. And one of the things that I tried to do in the intro, and we can talk about this later, is to emphasize the debt that any scholars have in looking at these texts, our debt in modern times to European and particularly Italian scholars. Our book is dedicated to the immortal Florentine papyrologist Medea Norsa. Why her parents named her that, I cannot figure out. And I discussed her role not only in saving papyri under fascism, but also in discovering this very famous Sappho fragment on a 3rd century BCE potsherd in 1937, the year before Mussolini promulgated his racial laws, which discriminated against Norsa and her fellow Jews. And I also discuss in great length, I'm the Latinist here, the famous Patale inscription by Sulpicia, datable to about 20 BCE. And that's a fascinating story because it was discovered by an Italian archaeologist named Paolino Mingazzini in 1936. But sadly, a French scholar in Rome, Jérôme Carcopino, who was a high-ranking official in the Vichy government, and he was the one that identified the author as Augustin Elgis Sulpicia, he took credit away from Mingazzini because Mingazzini did not join the fascist party, although Mingazzini enjoyed a very successful academic career after World War II. And one of the things I get great pride in is that I located Mingazzini's grandson in Milan, and I played some role in getting Mingazzini posthumous recognition for discovering the inscription. But there are lots of other Italian scholars who figure in our bibliography, and then many British scholars too. And so this is really an international project that owes so much to folks outside the United States.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. So I would start the discussion with Cristiana, then Simone, and then Luca. Of course, Cristiana, and then the answers of the authors, and then Simone, and then Luca. Right?
Right. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. So congratulations, first of all, on this wonderful volume, which is very, very useful. And thank you very much for providing students with a tool to access these women voices directly. I think it's extremely important. So thank you very much for this. And of course, speaking of animals, I'm interested in Anita, and I would like to hear something about her. And I've read the introduction in your volume, which is very interesting. The episode about Anita's travel is extremely interesting. But what I like for you to emphasize is the importance of Anita as a not only as one of the few women poets that we have that have been transmitted, but also one of the most important, probably, because she's as far as we know, she is the one of the earliest Hellenistic epigrammists, and the first one that set her poems in a bucolic landscape, and the first one that foregrounds animals in her poems as subjects, as individuals with a biography. And so I believe that she's extremely important, and she needs to be read as one of the most important poets in ancient Greece. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Cristiana, thank you so much. I could not agree more. I have always loved Anita and have been surprised that more volumes haven't featured her work, but she is a poet. We're not exactly sure where she lived, but our best guess is that she is from a town in Arcadia called Tegea. And her Florawid is between 290, 310 BCE. She appears to have been writing right around the same time that Gnosis was writing in Epizephyri and Locris in southern Italy. So she, her epigrams survive through the median of the Palatine and Planudian anthologies. And more complete poems of hers survive than of any other female poet of the Greco-Roman antiquity, of whom, we have extant works. There are 19 epigrams of hers, of certain authorship, 2 that are probably hers, and an additional 3 or 4 more that may are probably not hers, but nevertheless, her writing is very, very fascinating. As you mentioned, she's one of the first poets to use bucolic idyllic landscapes, which contain refreshing springs, fountains, vineyards, which serve as pastoral vignettes, or for where encounters between shepherds who are toiling in the summer heat, or wayfarers who are toiling on their journey, to not only stop and rest beside cool springs and cool breezes, but also have interactions with pastoral rural deities there, like, Pan and the nymphs of the grottos, for example. So she may have influenced later bucolic poets like Theocritus and Virgil. She was heavily imitated by the Hellenistic epigrammatist Nasalces in both style and subject matter. He also authored quatrains on the decease of animals, and appears to have some of his epigrams read, really quite similarly to those of Anite in voice and in subject matter. So that's really quite interesting. And then, of course, Theocritus and Virgil, whose, poet, singer, goatherds, and shepherds meet in pastures during the heat of noon. They sing sweet songs on reed pipes about unrequited love. They feature ideal shepherds who are friends of the nymphs and of Pan and the muses, and of wild beasts, and of Priapus and Hermes. And then, Virgil's eclogues, which I think need no commentary at all. So we can see this sort of thin line, but I do want to mention that we do see some of the setting motifs as early as Sappho. I'm thinking of Sappho Fragment 2, which was inscribed on the Ostrakon that Medea Norsa discovered, and
That's right.
yeah, which features a beautiful setting beside a temple with shaded trees that sort of drip down, shimmering light, and soporific sounds, and lull one to sleep. It's not quite the same as bucolic, but one sees kind of a hint of that beautiful atmosphere there. And it as you mentioned, there are a number of really beautiful funerary epigrams that allow a glimpse into the life of an animal who is almost, as you said, treated as a subject, almost as a personified subject. And I suspect that Anite had in mind to really have her audience enter into the emotional life, as the kind of the tragic moment of this animal's passing. These epigrams use allusions to Homer, for example, and other poets like Aeschylus. So you know, increasing perhaps the bathos of these extraordinary moments. My favorite is, you know, a quatrain epigram in which that features a puppy that was of a hunting dog stock, who was struck in its paw by a venomous viper that was speckle-necked as the puppy was hunting in thickets and bushes. Another really lovely one features a beached dolphin, or possibly a whale, who launched itself from the depths of the sea as it swam beside a ship whose figurehead bore its image and is now beached, you know, on the shore. And then finally, a really beautiful one that I think kind of links two motifs that we see in her poetry. One in which that features a grasshopper and a cicada, who were pets of a young girl named Miro, who placed them both in a common tomb. So not only do we have these animals, but also the young girl. And then finally, another feature of her poems, of her epigrams, that is so lovely, is we see that young girl named Miro, I think, connected to the funerary epigrams of her, in which we see young girls, feature young girls who die before they are married. So I find her poems just absolutely lovely and endearing, and really worthy of being read, certainly by undergraduates. And you know, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, I hope that this volume at least makes her poetry a little bit more accessible to students. So thank you for that wonderful question.
Thank you.
Simone,
And of your lovely work on animals too, which I have always enjoyed.
I'm just curious, do you think that some of those epigrams, at least some of them, could be real epigrams, so meant to be really, you know, inscribed in funerary monuments, or not, or just literary?
It's I think it's a little hard to tell, but my sense is that they are they're literary, and that they are intended to evoke a funerary setting, so that the reader is kind of taken on into a journey and brought into a very specific setting in a very specific context that has a long tradition of inscribed work, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah, I always wondered
Cristiana.
I always wondered why sometimes you cannot really tell the species of the animals. To me, it was like, you know, if you have a funerary monument with a sort of a picture of the animal, so the inscription can be so elusive and without, you know, really saying anything specific of the animal, because you have the portrait of the animal on the tomb. So I always wondered whether that was the case for those two epigrams, that you cannot tell what kind of animal is she's referring to.
Yeah, whether it's like a grasshopper, perhaps, or a rooster. That one, and
also the dolphin could be a dolphin.
Also, the dolphin could be, yeah.
The animal. So, thank you very much, Angela, and congratulations. Okay.
Thank you, Cristiana, and now the floor to Simone Beta.
Thank you very much, Aglaia, and also thank you to the three authors of this excellent book, really interesting book, and I wish that also in Italy we might write something like this, because it could be very useful for our students, too, university students, but also high school students. My question starts from Sappho. Of course, Sappho has a prominent position in the anthology. She is the first author chronologically, but also because she is probably the most famous among the female writers of Greece, and this is shown also by the success she had, not only in Greece. Now you remember the famous epigram attributed to Plato, where he says that she is the 10th muse, but also in Latin poetry. Catullus translated into Latin a poem by Sappho, so showing his interest in this kind of poetry, and also that he thought that it was a wonderful poem that needed to be translated. And among the poets who were fascinated by Sappho's poetry, there was of course a woman, and she is also part of the collection. And I think of Gnosis, who actually always presents herself as a kind of a second Sappho, no? And if you read through the 12 epigrams that are attributed to her, you see that no, she tries to give of herself a portrait which is somehow similar to that of Sappho. No, she mentions temples to Aphrodite, or she says she is a teacher, she has students, and so in a way she tries to portray herself as another Sappho, and she basically says this also in what we suppose to be the first and the last poems of her collection. What I would like to know, if how do you think this position is true? I mean, she was really a second Sappho, or she wanted to be portrayed like this in order to have more success among her readers?
Who of the authors is answering? You have to mute yourself.
Muted myself, I'm sorry. Yeah. So thank you for that lovely question. And I found myself just really delighting in everything that you were saying about Gnosis. Yes, so Gnosis does appear to certainly bring in into her poetry motifs that Sappho does. She uses some of the same techniques. For example, she names herself in several Sphragus moments, just as Sappho does, for example, in Sappho 1. And the prominent featuring of Aphrodite in her poetry is also very important in terms of thinking about her relationship with Sappho. But she also, I think it's worth pointing out, pays tribute to at least one other writer, the dramatist, the Syracusan dramatist, Reinthon. So we have 12 grams of hers which survive. It's impossible to know whether there were others, but it would be really fascinating to know if there were. And how, if so, how, if there were other writers who were celebrated in her works. I don't know what her intention was with regard to her, self-proclaimed relationship with Sappho, but it does seem as though she was really attempting to curate a voice that was reminiscent of Sappho, that echoed Sappho, and that built upon Sappho's voice. In the first poem in the collection of poems by Gnosis, of course, takes an erotic theme, just as many of Sappho's poems do. It begins, "Nothing is sweeter than Eros, all other blessings are second, I spit even honey from my mouth." Gnosis says this, and then the one whom Aphrodite has not favored does not know what kind of flower her roses are. So the erotic theme is introduced by way of a compressed preamel, which is exactly how Sappho 16 is introduced. Some say that a cavalry, some say an infantry, etc., is the best thing on the black earth, but I say that it is whatever someone desires. So that theme of Eros in Gnosis's initial poem certainly conveys Sapphic themes, a little bit of the Sapphic voice, Sapphic literary style. And then also compressed within it seems to be a reference to Sappho fragment 55, wherein the Sapphic narrator claims that no one will remember an unnamed woman after she dies, since she has no share of the roses of Pieria. The Pierian spring, of course, being a river sacred to the Muses. So she's clearly evoking Sappho here, and unlike the unnamed woman in Sappho's poem, who has no share of the Muses, or no share of the Muses and of the roses, Sappho is, Gnosis does name herself. Gnosis says this. So she claims that she does in fact know what kind of flower roses are, which are, of course, the kind of flower that Sappho integrated into her poetry, and which, of course, in that poetry bear a relationship to Aphrodite. So that was just the opening poem of her collection in a quatrain. There are compressed in multiple layers of allusions to Sappho. Throughout her poetry, there are, as you mentioned, a number of epigrams, dedicatory epigrams to naming that celebrate objects, quite a few paintings of women who dedicated their paintings to Aphrodite, excuse me. And then the final poem of the collection, Gnosis functions as her own imaginary funerary epitaph. So the voice she brings forward calls out to a wayfaring stranger to pause for a moment to appreciate the life of the deceased. And in this poem, she is the deceased, one imagines, right? And in this epigram, the speaker speaks to this wayfarer, inviting them that should he sail to Mytilene, the land of lovely choruses, of course, that makes us think immediately of Sappho and of Alcaeus as well, to bring there the name of Gnosis, beloved by the Muses and native to Locris. So other scholars such as Marilyn Skinner and Jane Snyder have noted that the quatrain probably served as an epilogue to Gnosis's published collection, and also signals that Gnosis is Sappho's literary descendant and equal, and as she commands the reader to carry her own name abroad, even to Sappho's homeland, perhaps indicating that she sees herself as, if not a rival of Sappho, at least an equal.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And now we go towards Rome, but of course we can always go back to Greece. And Luca, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Aglaia. First of all, I'd like to thank, sorry for the phone, just the right moment. Okay, let me just silence it. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank the authors for making accessible not only a substantial number of women's writing, but also a wide variety of literary genres practiced by them. I have just a small point about the Pompeian inscription, and I beg your pardon in advance if it's a bit too specific. First of all, the graffito is not lost, really, as the introduction to this section states. In fact, the plaster on which it was scratched has been detached from the wall, and it is now stored in the Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Naples. This point is somewhat important because on that same slab of plaster, there are a few other shorter and more colloquial graffiti in close proximity to this longer one. This situation, I think, shows us that authorship is a difficult word in inscriptions like this one, or in a different way in the Colossus inscriptions. The speaking eye, the fictional speaker, so to say, of these verses is clearly female, I think. It is likely, at least in my opinion, that a woman was also the literary author of these verses scratched on the wall. But this is nothing more than an educated guess, I would say. And who physically scratched the graffiti on the wall? Who was its physical author, in other words? Perhaps a woman, but I guess this is a real mystery. To sum up, there are three different persons involved in the authorship of this graffito. The most prominent of them is the fictional speaker, but there are also the literary author and the physical author of the graffito. And the problem is that it is usually easy for us to implicitly conflate the identities and the genders of these different authors. The other graffiti in close proximity complicate the problem. They are short salutations and puns on the names between a man and a woman, Ismarus and Krokine, something like Blondie. Krokine is very likely to be a resident of the house, but who was Ismarus? Was he a friend, a lover, or maybe a regular client of Krokina? Is the long poetic graffito somehow related to these other shorter inscriptions or not? Was Ismarus its physical author, writing something for Krokine, maybe a poem he knew she appreciated? Or Krokine herself, wittily showing Ismarus that she doesn't trust any man in matters of love, maybe Ismarus included? Or again, a female friend or lover of Krokine, warning her that she shouldn't trust any man, again, maybe Ismarus included? Or finally, anybody else totally unrelated to Ismarus and Krokina, scribbling away on the wall while waiting to be received? I would say possibilities are endless and all intriguing, and I am curious to hear what the authors of the book think on this subject of multiple authorship. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Graverini. Yes, this one of the things that when we use this particular text in the class, I have the students ponder because there are no simple answers, as you pointed out. We have multiple potential authors. Even the physical location and who has access to that matters greatly into who might be doing it. What I attempted to do in this section is kind of leave it open because perhaps as you pointed out, I'm not sure either. And I don't know, I don't feel qualified enough, I suppose, to make more than an educated guess at it because there's so many permutations regarding it. So I chose to put the text in there for the point that you made, that clearly the text presents itself as from a female writer to a female audience. But who the writer is and what level of it is and what the level of the audience is kind of a more flexible. And leave it there, just providing the access so that students and scholars alike could have that text available to make some of those arguments and try to work through it. Personally, I don't know. to be honest, as a kind of a blunt statement of it. I know what I want it to be, but I don't know what it actually is. I don't know, Judy, do you have a sense on your end as well?
No, I agree with both of you.
I wonder if Luca has a sense, if he wants to
No, I totally
venture an
share
answer.
Bartolo and Judith's doubts. That was the point.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your
Thank
answer.
you.
Thank you.
Can I add a question on Rome, and then if Luca wants to kick in, also for our many students that are connected, do you find that there is a difference of voice between Greek women and Roman women, which are not Roman women only? Rome as a multicultural empire. Do you find that there is a difference, also due to the different legal status, legal condition that women had in antiquity? Do you find there is a different voice, a different position in the world, even if in this very broad, put in a broad way, of course, because I'm sure each and every context is different. But would you find that there is some speciality of the women in Greece that you selected, and some particular voice of the Roman women that you selected?
I guess I can start, and Judy can chime in as well, because I know she's got a lot to say on this particular topic. I think what I'll pick up on is what Aglaia, you mentioned, that each particular context is important and changes. And I wonder, but I hesitate to an extent, because I don't know if we would ask the same question of men. A male author in Greece as the male author in Rome, and try to triangulate all of that at once, and why it's a specifically female question. It's a valid question. I think I would answer it in the same way I would for what's the difference between Homer and Virgil. There's individual kinds of ideas and contexts that are there. I like, for particular, Sulpicia, I like seeing the kind of interplay where she's ambiguous in every location, and why that might be. What is she trying to negotiate? I try to be aware of my own biases and what I'm trying to bring to the text, that implicitly, just by looking back at it, I don't see the same sort of presentation from Sulpicia as I do from a Sappho. But again, that's a long period of time, different cultures, different social performance of the text versus oral and written and lyric, or music and non-music and things of that nature. So I hesitate on the question only because would we ask the same thing of male authors across the board? I think
we would. I'm not so sure that we wouldn't. Also because I was thinking of the letter of Vindolanda, of Claudia Severa, and that is one of the, for me at least, one of the most interesting texts. And it really gives you a special lens to see a private letter, but that at the same time, to me, has a formal tone. And I saw that in the book, you do write that it might be one of the first female written cursive. But this is the same kind of question. You said you don't see it, but at the end, you do the same question. What is a female writing? Because how can you understand that there is a female writing or a male writing? So what I meant was a broad question, didactically, to see if there is a difference in tone, because you can have a different tone when you have more legal rights. But this is, of course, the context and the centuries are so different. About the Vindolanda tablet, I think that it would be very interesting also if you say something about that, but also in the future to compare the legal tablets from Pompeii and Ercolano, where there are lots of women voices, because they are asking for mortgages, but we don't know why. We know the amounts of the mortgages. We know that they are lending money with a very high interest. We know that they're active in selling and buying slaves, that they are managing the estates. So we know a lot of their private matters, but without knowing their private why they actually, you know, if they're planning to make their enterprise stronger, if they're planning to give money to someone. I mean, we don't know why they're taking the mortgages, but we do know that they are active in doing that. And we also have some scholars who wrote some essays on that. So to you back the floor.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I mean, we are in initial discussions with each other of we need a second volume, because there's so much more out there, especially on the prose side, that needs to be explored. And we already were over the word limit for the publisher for this volume. We had a special permission to keep going, knowing that there was so much more out there. So yes, I think there are those types of texts that need to be brought forward, and then we can talk through what does that mean? What are they trying to get at with those things? Judy, I know you were looking like you had something.
I think I must have had something at some point. Yeah, thank you, Aglaia, and everyone else for these wonderful questions and for giving us this opportunity to share what went into this volume. In addition to this contrast between Greek and Roman women's voices, which I think is very complicated, we also want to look at the issue of social class.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the reasons that the discovery of the funerary inscription to the slave, the Greek slave Patali, the lectrix, who clearly was indispensable in Sulpicia's literary education. That's why it's so important, because I think it's very complicated when you talk about what's Greek and what's Roman. These Roman women, and Roman men for that matter, are being literarily educated by Greek slaves. And they're the ones that control the learning, that control the access to these important Greek texts. And one of the important reasons for moving to looking at the prose text is that I see echoes, and I've argued this, of Sappho in the letter of Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, to her son Gaius. And again, when you look at the Patali inscription, there are that Sulpicia wrote, there are allusions to Erinna. And this all comes from, this Greco-Roman literary culture that involves both aristocrats and enslaved people in this amazing, multicultural literary scene in ancient Rome. So I think the difference that I would posit between the Greek voices and the Roman ones is that the Roman women, well, particularly Sulpicia, appear to be very heavily educated and steeped in the Greek literary tradition. But then again, the agents of this were Greek slaves, and in this particular case, female Greek slaves. So this raises all kinds of interesting questions about social class and education too.
Wonderful. Now, if our discussants have a second round of questions, and we can also open the floor for our audience, so someone who would like to pose a question. You can raise hands. Or else I would like to hear on Sulpicia, because we of course have an audience of lots of legal historians, and so Sulpicia is dear to us if there are no questions yet from the audience. Maurizio, okay. The floor is yours.
Yeah, you were talking about Sulpicia, so I was solicited to intervene. I wanted to introduce another dichotomy similar to the dichotomy that you introduced between the female Greek voice and the Roman female voice.
Yeah.
And this is about Sulpicia exactly. I read that text many years ago, so I'm not sure that I remember it correctly. But as far as I remember, it's possible to detect in it little signs that Sulpicia is speaking using expressions and stereotypes typical of the male elegiac speech. For example, the Juvenis, the poor, so the beloved, wears the Greek surname, Kerinthus. So normally it's the Puella wearing the Greek surname, Delia, Nemesis, Cynthia, and so forth. Again, Sulpicia, if I remember correctly, confesses a servitium amoris towards the Juvenis. And the servitium amoris is another stereotypical expression of the male elegiac language. So, and the Juvenis is attributed to him a tectus amor, which is another element that is normally typically feminine in the elegiac discourse. So I was wondering if you could detect more of this effort of a female voice of taking control of male elegiac expressions to create her own elegiac language. I don't know if I could make myself clear, but this is more or less my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. The thing that's always fascinating to me regarding Sulpicia is she's clearly aware and using these elegiac tropes, such as Servitium Amoris, but she's almost twisting them and doing something a little bit original with them. So I'm thinking of Sulpicia 1, where she starts out using some of those same vocabulary, like tectisse, she's covering up, but she's covered by pudor, which is not what you would expect from the elegiac lens. You're going the opposite direction. And she starts to describe something in Sulpicia 1 that is referencing Sappho, thinking about calling out to Aphrodite for help with this particular situation, which again is an elegiac idea. But then she ends it with not a Servitium Amoris thing, but as a, I want to be remembered as equals, as a worthy person for a worthy love. So she shifts it from a Servitium aspect to more of an equal aspect. And so on top of that, you know, you have a female elegist taking the role of a male elegist, which is himself supposed to be an inversion of male gender. So you're like an inversion of an inversion. And what does that give you? Are you back to where you started, or are you at someplace different? So I think she's aware and definitely working within the elegiac tropes, but she's innovating on all levels. And to me personally, this is my side, I think she's the best elegist because of that. But I am biased completely.
If I may just add on to Bart's discussion as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
one of the things that strikes me in Sulpicia as well is the self-consciousness about the language of writing and using the language of writing and of poetry within the poem itself. I'm thinking Ovid does this quite frequently as well, but you know, language, references to belly, say for example, mea gaudia naret, my joy speaks of itself, so I think that self-consciousness is there as well, that self-conscious literary language.
Could I just add a postscript? I agree with everything that was said. We can pretty much infer that Sulpicia belonged to a literary circle that included both Tibullus and Ovid. And I have argued that Ovid makes reference to, not necessarily flattering reference to Sulpicia in several of his poems, sections of the Metamorphoses, individual elegies, critiquing exactly what you're talking about, the way in which she inverts these traditional literary tropes that involve positions of power and control. Let me also add that if I am correct, and Sulpicia is the daughter of this illustrious jurist, legal expert, she uses legal language all the time, Aglaia. One of my favorite references is Tibullus 3:14, when she says to her guardian, although you don't allow me to have my own arbitrium, my own legal free will. And then she uses the verb ago, agere, which has a legal sense too, in talking about her control over her personal situation. She wants to be with her lover on her birthday. By the way, the pseudonym for her male lover is probably, I would agree with this David Russell, a bilingual pun on the word for wax, and refers to the wax tablets in which to which she entrusts her words and her sentiments. She's very much a bilingual kind of poet there.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other question or addition? If we don't, I would like to thank you all for participating, and I would like to leave the last word, if everyone agrees, to Judith. And then,
well, again, thank you so much for making this all happen. And my questions would be, where do we go from here? How do we share this volume and or a future volume that looks at women as prose authors with an Italian audience? Should we translate and expand the introduction that I wrote, because it's almost exclusively on Anglophone scholars? Should we think about providing Italian translations along with the English? Are the notes, this wonderful rich commentary that you've provided, I didn't do the commentary, are they sufficiently clear to Italian students? We would love feedback from Italian students and professors who've actually used this book about how it can be more helpful to them and inclusive of them. And I really thank you again for the inclusivity of today's session, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone. And Rosario, puoi interrompere lo streaming così possiamo fare anche due chiacchiere? Let me...
Okay.